The idea that deregulation didn't cause the financial crisis is bizarre. That is a mad thing to claim. So, for anyone who doesn't know, Bastiat is a Twitch streamer and corporate oil lawyer and self-described neoliberal. And he's really eloquent and he's good at forming arguments, probably because he's a lawyer. And he's irritatingly likable. But his defenses of neoliberalism are trash. So the way I'm going to do this, I'm going to play each sort of segment he's deciding, talking about what he's doing. So I don't want to take anything he says out of context. And then I'm going to talk about why it's shite. Yeah, he is... Actually, you know what? I think I was going to say he's pretty neoliberal, but the impression I get of the opinions that he holds, I think he's more classically liberal. I think he's an actual classical liberal. Not even a what's his name? Dave Rubin. Not even a Dave Rubin style classical liberal, an actual one. So first one, 3 to 6. Alright, so I'm just going to play. This is opening statement. This is the longest period I think he speaks in the whole thing. So we'll just sort of see what he's saying for 5 minutes about neoliberalism.
Start with you, Bastiat. 5 minutes on the clock.
All right. Well, it's good to be here again. Thanks for your time, Lance. And ladies and gentlemen, neoliberalism is a term for the political and economic policies associated with free market, globalized capitalism. The term was popularized in the 1980s by American President Ronald Reagan, British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, and, of course, economist Milton Friedman, who was perhaps the most influential economist of the second half of the 20th century. And it is in their transformative wake that the term remains relevant today. Its first use dates back to the Walter Lippmann Colloquium of 1938, a conference of intellectuals who met in Paris and aimed to build a new liberalism that could stand up against the collectivism of the fascists and the communists who were prevailing in the day. And it has taken its shape in this modern sense. Proponents of neoliberalism like myself see free markets and free trade as a foundation for human flourishing, creating the most favorable conditions for job growth, technological innovation, transnational collaborations that promote peace and global prosperity, trade deals, and individual freedom. We believe that government interference with free market systems generally, though not always, promotes waste and inefficiency and at a high level stagnation. We reject excessive regulations on industry, especially where they spare industries from competition where it should otherwise exist. So, for example, some key elements of this kind of deregulation is airlines, where we've seen success in lower rates and unbundling so that more people can fly at the price point that's right for them. Telecommunications, more innovation, gradual end of long distance charges, and now these magic computer phones from space. And then energy, including electricity and natural gas in particular, where prices have declined and demand, especially for electricity in the US, has flattened. Other countries have different experiences. We also reject high taxation, especially corporate taxation, and certain public services that are not subject to market competition, and generally believe in shrinking the size of government in certain functions and limiting that size of government to the protection of private property through not just good policies, but law enforcement, facilitating global commerce, and maintaining a strong military. So to paraphrase Milton Friedman in describing neoliberalism from his foundational essay, Neoliberalism and Its Prospects, written in 1951, neoliberalism accepts the 19th century classical liberal emphasis on the fundamental importance of the individual, but instead of laissez-faire markets free of all restrictions as a means to this end, it pursues the goal of the competitive order. It would seek to use competition among producers to protect consumers from exploitation, competition among employers to protect workers and owners of property, and competition among consumers to protect the enterprises themselves. The state would police the system, establish conditions favorable to competition and prevent monopoly, provide a stable monetary framework, and relieve acute misery and distress. The citizens would be protected against the state by the existence of a free private market and against one another by the preservation of competition. Critics of neoliberalism argue chiefly that its policies exacerbate rather than mitigate economic and social inequalities. They cite the effects of unregulated capitalism and the reduction or removal of safety nets typically provided by governments to support those who are economically and socially vulnerable. Perhaps more fundamentally, many critics seem to assert that neoliberalism fails to account for so-called structural forms of violence, systemic poverty, racism, and other forms of oppression. They argue that these hinder access to the benefits of free market capitalism that neoliberals like myself imply and indeed believe can be universally shared. They claim that because neoliberalism fails to acknowledge structural forms of oppression, it blames individuals for their failures rather than the systemic inequality that leads to social and economic vulnerability. So to go back to Milton Friedman, neoliberalism recognizes the very real need to accuse, or rather to relieve, acute misery and distress. For example, as he said, the government would have the function in the ideal system of relieving this misery and distress. Our humanitarian sentiments demand that some provision should be made for those who draw blanks in the lottery of life, as it were. Our world has become too complicated and intertwined. We've become too sensitive to leave this function entirely to private charity. It is essential, however, that the performance of this function involve the minimum of interference with the market, the engine of innovation and prosperity that makes the relief of misery and distress possible in the first place. There's justification for subsidizing people, for example, because they are poor, or whether they're farmers or city dwellers, white or black, men or women, young or old, or anyone in between. But there's no justification for subsidizing, for example, farmers or steel producers simply because they are farmers and steel producers, rather than, again, because they're poor. These criticisms ultimately, therefore, depend on the nature of the welfare state designed to remediate these issues. America's welfare state, for example, is threadbare in many ways, and it doesn't cover healthcare except for select groups, chiefly saddling businesses with this responsibility of the rest of American healthcare to the detriment of all. So, for example, many neoliberals now believe that healthcare should be made universal in the USA, as in all of its peer countries. Corporate taxes, which are chiefly passed on to consumers anyway, should be cut. And most importantly, America's borders should be open permanently to the people of the entire world, increasing wealth radically for America as well as for other countries. So, therefore, the key to that reform and improvement is the wealth made possible by free trade and free markets.
All right. Yeah. It's that quiff and the suit is very much like you can see the difference between him and Ben Burges, the like stereotypes of a lawyer versus an academic, which is funny in itself. So what's important here is Bastiat throws out a lot, and not a lot of it actually comes up in how he responds to different points and different debates. But what's important are that he tends to overly emphasize what neoliberalism does and doesn't really talk about what neoliberalism actually is. So I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with what he says about what neoliberalism is. It's just not enough, not emphasized right, and more emphasis on what it does rather than what it is. How I would differentiate between his conception of neoliberalism and mine, and you know, it's important. I think it's how you argue against various positions that he's going to take later on in the debate, and how you argue against that he might actually be closer to a classical liberal than a neoliberalism than a neoliberal, is that neoliberalism isn't just these free markets, and it isn't just about free markets making everyone better off. In fact, neoliberalism tends to accept that competition will necessarily make some people worse off. So what I would say is the difference between his definition and my definition is that I view neoliberalism as an ideology of the individual. It's an ideology which is sort of obsessed with making the individual individualistic and capitalistic, entrepreneurial, personally responsible, and all those things at the expense of being collectivized. It's all about how being individualistic is the most morally correct thing to do, because it's not just about like increasing profits. It's about it being morally like the best thing to be the free individual, the free individual liberty. Like that's where the libertarian angle goes into neoliberalism. It's about individual liberty and how fucking great that is. And it doesn't see that perfect individual as the best way to alleviate suffering, but as the most morally correct person to be. And this is fundamentally different from classical liberalism, which sees the individual as naturally self-interested and naturally competitive, and sees that self-interest as causing human flourishing. Like, the big flag's not great. It sees that the self-interest, the classical liberalism sees self-interest as causing that human flourishing that he's talking about, which is the first indication that I think he's probably closer to a classical liberal like Dave Rubin than a neoliberal. But neoliberals will seek individual liberty at the expense of other things. They don't necessarily think that individual liberty will cause human flourishing. What else was I going to say here? Yeah, he mentions Walter Lippmann, who, and it's Walter. He does love Thatcher, Sinan. So you might have some competition there. Yeah, Walter Lippmann view as like one of the big founders of neoliberalism, and all of his stuff was about how great the good society, the neoliberal society, would be, and how collectivized society has become morally corrupt with bondage. We all know that Sinan wants to shag Thatcher, right? Everyone knows that. So my difference between the difference between my definition and what Bastiat lays out is important, because it's going to come into how he talks about healthcare and how he talks about immigration and how he talks about welfare, because he can say, oh, Milton Friedman wanted universal basic income, or there are universal healthcare services that have neoliberal or marketized dimensions. Yeah, it's not. I mean, neoliberalism is dog shit. It's not a good ideology. But this is what they thought. They thought that the individual was great. That it's better to be free living under a bridge than part of a collectivized system. So there's like a few other points he brings up, but really it's not necessary to the overall arguments he's making. So I'm just gonna respond. I'll just skip on to the next section and see what he's got to say about the next things that he says.
And then foreign policy. So I'll try and take it in those two senses. First, everything you discussed as far as individual human flourishing is something that is one I would contest completely, or I would say is the job of a welfare state, where in Europe those problems have been addressed more helpfully through welfare states, especially in the Scandinavian countries, and where in the United States, to the extent those problems haven't been addressed, it seems to be due to the peculiarities of American government rather than to neoliberalism generally. So, for example, when you talk about, when you mentioned public spending, right? The European Union, fundamentally neoliberal project, right? Nevertheless, this figure may be a little different today now that Great Britain has signed its exit of the European Union. But nevertheless, the European Union, with 7% of the world's population, constitutes 50% of its public spending. And this European Union, which represents the kind of fundamental free trade, open borders, global capitalism that I'm talking about here, is nevertheless buttressed by a often described as very successful welfare state. The other notion that you mentioned was kind of the gigification of the economy, but it seems to me that is ultimately a very important question as far as perspective goes. What you describe as constant work and constant, really the loss of opportunities, seems to me to be a kind of a new opportunity for people of all different stripes to engage in new and different kinds of work. I mean, Twitch, for example, is one example of that. But when you talk about Airbnb, I mean, that's a way that people can maximize the use of a scarce resource, right? Hotel space, housing space, things like that. And I'll address foreign policy in the other rebuttal. But ultimately, what you talk about is less free time, more work. Ultimately, sounds like more opportunities to maximize your personal welfare.
Who loves the gigification of work? Who just absolutely loves that pure gigification of work experience? Every day you wake up and you think, you know what's great? I have fewer rights, less ability to negotiate with my employer, have to go start Twitch channels to try and, make paltry sums of money. Isn't that great? That's what free choice is all about. So, in his opening statement, he had a much better argument than anything he produces here, because, like, what he produces here is basically nonsense. he responds to something which Ben Burges was first talking about, in that neoliberalism isn't just a process, it's just a thing, it's a process, and one that encourages certain behaviours and policies. So states like Sweden went through massive periods of neoliberalisation and started from a different place than, say, the US. But then look at states like Greece, which was, of course, forced to go through like a horrible period of austerity and neoliberalisation, which gutted their health and welfare services. And so that period, that process of neoliberalisation is an uneven one. So when he talks about things like, oh, it's great because the European Union has massive public spending, that public spending isn't necessarily against neoliberalism. It's just that you have a huge amount of states which maybe started from having higher public spendings and then went through a neoliberalisation process. But also, neoliberalism, it's like having lots of public expenditure doesn't mean that you don't have neoliberalism. Like UK public expenditure on welfare has increased over. Yeah, that's not, that's right, Simon. Yeah, the UK's welfare system has increased in spending over decades. Even with cuts, even with anything else, it's still like that spending has. No worries. Just you, I can understand that. So yeah, UK. Let's talk about UK welfare for a second. UK welfare is deeply neoliberalised because it went through this period of neoliberalisation under Thatcher and then Blair and then now. So previously, you used to get welfare on like the condition of you, like whether you were unemployed or whatever. You were unemployed, so you got unemployment. Now, with this work-fairist neoliberal reforms, you have to prove that you're meeting certain criteria in order to get the welfare. So you have to prove that you're searching for a job 35 hours a week, that you go to job coaching interviews, or if you're disabled, that you go to work capability assessments. All of these things which are deeply personalised and deeply moved onto, like they move the responsibility away from the government and onto personal responsibility to get your welfare. So you can have that, and this costs a huge amount of money. They cost a massive amount of money to set up the infrastructure for work capability assessments, for the bureaucracy of deciding who can and who can't get welfare. And Bastiat would bring up in response to that UBI, which Milton Friedman proposed in a sense. But the problem with that being that if you were a neoliberal who wanted UBI, it would have to be set at a level low enough that you would have to necessarily be kept in a degree of poverty to encourage you to then get out of that poverty to go to work. And different neoliberals have taken that issue to heart and don't go after a UBI. But yeah, so welfare under neoliberalism is made into a particular form, and that's why why it's important to talk about neoliberalism more than just laissez-faire capitalism, but as a strategy of governmentality with a particular ideology. Yeah, so I think we can move on to the next section, but I did like his point about gigification being great, because who doesn't love being able to turn their property that they obviously own because they're just an upstart individual into an Airbnb and then increase rents across cities. That's great. Oh, yeah, everybody loves means testing. Means testing is my favourite. It's not even just means testing. It's means testing. It's conditionality, because means testing would be like, oh, you don't make this income threshold, so you don't get a benefit. But the type of neoliberal workfairism is you could still be poor, but if you don't search for jobs for 35 hours a week, or under universal credit, if you don't fill out your online work diary a certain number of times a week, then your benefits will be reduced. Yeah. Let's move on to the next. I think next he talks a bit about universal basic income. So I think I might just skip his next section, go straight 21 minutes, because nobody wants to talk about universal basic income for ages under neoliberalism. It's not great.
Anything like the kind of influence on its member states' policies that it has now.
Okay. Well, I would, and by the way, we definitely should get to the foreign policy at some point, but I wanted to talk about this stuff first. First of all, as far as healthcare goes, I'm not saying we should nationalize it, but I think you could have universal coverage without a nationalized system like they have in, for example, UK. Plenty of countries on the continent and East Asia, have healthcare systems that are universal but not nationalized. So that would be another example of drawing a line here with welfare. We wouldn't want to nationalize something if we could, for example, still preserve some private market, some private competition, and nevertheless have the government involved to the extent it needs to be involved for universal coverage. However that might work, there are a bunch of models out there in Europe and again in East Asia for that. But then as far as open borders go, I think, first of all, as far as ideal policies, I think it's worth talking about ideal policies. I mean, we, for example, here on Twitch have a very robust left wing that often talks about how socialism would work in various ways that have never actually been implemented, but which are interesting to discuss and worth noting. So I don't think it's worth writing that off. But as far as open borders go, frankly, the fact that we've got more restricted borders here in the Trump administration and the Obama administration, I think dovetails with the fact that also the Trump administration has been dialing back on tariffs. I mean, they are trying to retreat from this neoliberal world order and go back to good old-fashioned conservative isolationism. And so it's in that sense, yeah, it's that America First policy represents a retreat from the kind of policies I'd like to see. I think neoliberal policies. But even then, in the European Union, there have been exceptions to what you say. Germany's very gracious acceptance, and not just Germany, other countries there too, but Angela Merkel specifically accepted all of those Syrian refugees that fled war in the Middle East. So it's not to say that the European Union is fully open borders, as again, I as an American would like to see my country fully open with respect to its borders, but it is the best example of an open borders experiment in the world today, and is certainly worth consideration. Finally, I don't know, I'd be curious why you think the EU undermines European welfare states. The only argument I've heard to that effect is one, the euro, which could be dissected from the EU, and two, open immigration, for example, Polish plumbers.
All right. Let's talk about that. So let's talk first about immigration, because that's something that he talks about later on in the video, and one that he talks about saying that we need more neoliberalism to have better immigration. So let's talk about what happens under neoliberalized immigration systems, and good example would be either here or Canada, places where your conditionality to become a resident in the country is based on your ability to become part of the neoliberal system, earn certain amounts of money. In the UK, your spouse also has to earn a certain amount of money to be competitive, so that you could be nice and a nice neoliberal, individually responsible, capitalistic individual. That would be a neoliberal ethic of individual responsibility put onto immigration. Maybe you can argue maybe that free movement of labour is a benefit under neoliberalism, which might also be the case. But if you're talking about the neoliberal ethic of individuality, which is at the core of neoliberalism, then you're going to get systems like Canada and the UK with our dog shit immigration policies. Next, let's talk about this idea of neoliberalized competition-based healthcare, because it's a wild one and a bad one, and we have lots of evidence to show why neoliberalized competitive healthcare is not great. The first place that you would start off is for private healthcare to work in a system which has public healthcare. By definition, the private healthcare would have to be better. So if you're arguing for a system which has both, you're necessarily arguing for unequal treatment of people and under unequal treatment of health results, and you're necessarily arguing that if you have money, you deserve better healthcare. Otherwise, the idea of having a private healthcare provider would make no sense. Nobody goes, I feel like buying some slightly worse healthcare today. Anyone got any ideas? Just gonna go around the corner to my slightly shitter. Do you want to go to the? No, I don't want to go to the NHS. It's too good. I want a sense of danger in my healthcare, and I pay for that danger out the nose. It's not how it works. And then we can look at systems that previously had universal healthcare and see what happens to them when they go through a period of neoliberalization. And a good example of that would be Chile, which previously had universal healthcare, but through the period of neoliberalization, it deeply damaged the provision of healthcare, specifically for low income and specifically for disabled people, because it went through that process where it had to make private healthcare better, or it had to make nationalised healthcare worse, and it slashed the nationalised healthcare because it's neoliberal and it wants to make competition better for private groups.
Administration, but also by the Obama administration, and it sounds like the Clinton administration, although I'm less aware of immigration policy back then. But look, at the end of the day, we're talking about policies that we know are a good thing and we know that would work. So to the extent that you would dispute that open borders is a neoliberal policy, well, I mean, I guess we could have that discussion. But I'm making the point that we should have more open borders. And again, to the extent that we haven't, the problem is not that we've had too much neoliberalism; it's that we haven't had enough. So yeah, in that sense, I would like to roll back remaining tariffs. I'd like to get rid of them all completely. I'd like to open the borders of the United States to the entire world. So
that's something I was going to mention. And he mentioned in the previous section that Trump had been rolling back on tariffs and Trump is no longer being neoliberal. One of the first things Trump did was to get rid of regulatory bodies. One of the first things he did with one of the major Dodd-Frank Act regulatory functions after the 2000 financial crash, what he did was install a man who wanted to get rid of it, and then he slashed its funding by 25%. So the idea that Trump isn't within this neoliberal framework is, I think, disingenuous. Trump, it's hard to pin him down in any ideology because he's just a fucking idiot. But he's certainly fallen into these aspects of neoliberalism, and to just say that, oh, Trump represents thanks, Anan, I appreciate you. And since Trump represents saying Trump represents a rollback of neoliberalism is, I think, a bit disingenuous or a bit too quick. He could jump right into fascism. Who knows? He's a maniac, but he's doing things that are in line with what neoliberal elites would like to happen. And that is a tendency in regarding to the topic of this debate, which was, is neoliberalism a force for good? The tendency to career more and more towards authoritarian state functions is one that we've seen throughout neoliberalism throughout the world. So the idea that Trump is an outlier is not true. We look at the UK or Brazil or fucking France or all these places which have seen neoliberalism career in towards fascism, which in my books would indicate that it wasn't a force for good. Anyway, moving on.
So in the sense of addressing the question of, is neoliberalism a force for good, then to the extent that that's a component of it, I think it is. It's just one that tragically hasn't been fully realized yet, and hopefully someday will. But let's see, you were talking about foreign policy as well. And I'd be curious where you make that tie between neoliberalism and foreign policy, because so much of what you described seems to be the issue of bad American foreign policy can be fundamentally separated from the notion of free market capitalism. I mean, for example, America's interventions in the 20s and 30s in Latin America were motivated not by some kind of free market capitalism, but by a state, almost a state capture in a sense. Motivating, the government acting on behalf of certain established interests rather than on behalf of a competitive free market. So to the extent that the U.S. government has not lived up to these ideals, again, that doesn't discredit the ideals. It discredits the United States government, which, again, I'm happy to sell out when it is not an agent of human freedom. So you know, as
10
let's see
seconds.
here, we talk about yeah, I mean, I'd like to know like how it is that you can tie all of these interventions to neoliberalism, and I'd also like to know again if the United States is indeed grinding up the entire world, why it hasn't succeeded in taking on Venezuela, for example, why it is so capable of organizing coups in some places like Brazil, which you mentioned, which you know it seems very attenuated to blame on the United States, and yet Venezuela still
It's time.
continues to exist in its form.
Well, this was useful since it's a good thing we've just done a video on this. How can US state action be connected to free market capitalism? Again, notice that he's using neoliberalism and free market capitalism interchangeably, which is bad definitioning. Do better definitioning, Bastiat, because free market capitalism, as we know, isn't neoliberalism. But let's talk about interventions. This idea that U.S. state capture isn't about free markets is just at its core another statement like about how neoliberalism isn't just about markets. It's essential for the state to create the system and to create the markets that it's want. I want to let's talk about capturing the state for a second. Might established interest become who can say? But like I don't understand what Bastiat thinks these established interests are, or how people gain power and accumulate power under capitalism. Does he not realize that under a free market system you're gonna get state capture because the free market forces are gonna gather capital and gather power and start lobbying the government to increase that power? And that's exactly what happened to establish the neoliberal system in the first place. Powerful actors funded lobby groups, funded universities, funded bank lobbies to lobby the government and to cut regulation and to impose this neoliberal order on people. So, it's such a bizarre argument to say that state capture doesn't have anything to do with capitalist policy. And if we move on to the idea of American foreign policy having nothing to do with neoliberalism, I mean, the first obvious one, not talking about Iraq, but the first obvious one would be Chile, which, you know, everyone watching this would know that Chile was the site of a fascist and neoliberal coup, led and advised by Milton Friedman and the Chicago boys, who were instrumental in developing neoliberal economics. They advised them on imposing all of the economic not sanctions, but the economic cuts, the cuts to public services, the slashing of welfare, the mass privatization, all to open up the free market, which resulted in poverty, breadlines, and death. And America did this because neoliberal free markets are in its interest. It's not like it's such a bizarre idea to say, well, how has America's foreign policy got anything to do with neoliberal interests? It's just such a bizarre thing to say. Hey, Gogo1010Y. Nice to see you. I mean, it doesn't mean that to say that all interventions are necessarily always drawn by that sense, but like neoliberalism has to expand and it has to go into new areas, which is part of the reason why Iraq War happened, because they had to get into new areas, into an area of the world which had previously resisted neoliberalization, which was Iraq, and then they immediately privatized and slashed. America organizing a coup in Bolivia because Morales won't give them cheap access to lithium reserves is not a capitalist establishment interest. Yeah, who knows? Who knows what their possible material interest could have been there? You know what? It could just be that they're bad guys. They're just nasty folks up at the top of America. They've got no material interests. They're just bad guys. And that's what it is. It's nothing to do with neoliberalism or free market ideology. Okay, let's move on to the next thing he says, which we're at 30. I think the most. Oh, cool. We've got uh, we've got got a cool guy in the comments. Uh, you say communism results in breadlines. What breadlines resulted from capitalism? Chile. Breadlines happened, resulted in the uh, breadlines were the result of the coup in Chile, which imposed neoliberalization and privatization of privatization and caused massive poverty and massive hunger. There were massive breadlines in Chile during that period.
Now called "The Data Shows That Socialism Works," where it ranks all the countries in the world by the degree to which they approximate various socialist ideals. The Nordics obviously come out on top, and all of these things work very, very nicely.
Okay, to you, Bastiat.
Yeah, sure. So if we're going to go a la carte, and I respect going a la carte here because, there's a great a la carte example of open borders immigration in the United States, and that is, say, the United States' immigration policy from the late 19th century to the early 20th century, with, again, the racist exception of the Chinese exclusion laws, was otherwise largely free, and the United States flourished from that. So there have certainly been times in history where this policy has existed in what, you could, I think, still in that time call the United States a liberal country, even if neoliberalism might not have been a fact by
GDP growth doesn't mean that that growth went to people who needed it. GDP growth is not a good measure of whether a country is just, whether its poorest are suffering. Under the imposition of neoliberalism under Pinochet, there was massive spike in poverty. There was massive spike in and there was a massive decline in health standards. I mean, if you could look at Chile right now, rioting in the streets, well, not right now because of coronavirus, but in the past few years, rioting in the streets because of the imposition of neoliberalism, I'd be surprised if you could make the argument that the imposition of neoliberalism in Chile was anything great. It wasn't. We know this. There's no point defending it.
That point. So there's
first round liberalism.
First round liberalism. That sounds good. As far as that goes, I'm curious. Like the notion of the notion that the United States, or rather that neoliberalism requires exporting. The point you made about dovetailing of offshoring work and yet simultaneously trying to prevent people from coming into the United States. I mean, it seems like immigrants have been picked on and bashed on by just about every government in the history of the world. Tragically enough, they're an easy target. And I'm really curious about this notion that there is a correlation there. I don't see it. I mean, it seems like immigrants are bashed on because of in essence, parochial political considerations rather than out of a desire to keep the workers working in their cheap factories instead of coming here to the United States. I mean, typically the economic arguments against immigration here are about the wages of native citizens rather than, the notion that we're not going to keep people working in those countries if they come to work here. So I think that is a very tenuous point. And beyond that, I do want to make a point about the notion that you said about bosses and workers and the freedom of workers to make decisions. Look, part of individual freedom means not just the freedom of the worker, but also the freedom of the employer. For example, I think it's very reasonable that employers should be able to fire people that are members of very controversial political organizations. One of the best tools we have in the United States for fighting the alt-right is publicly shaming them and then having them fired. So I think that's a very good thing. 10 seconds,
but I'm going to give you an extra 20 because Ben interrupted you. Sorry about that. But
no, that's all good. So I think it's a very good thing that we have this kind of what would you call it? At-will employment, because generally it means more flexibility in the labor market. And again, assuming the government isn't putting its thumb on the scale in the opposite direction, more flexibility, less unemployment, especially among youth in the United States compared to Europe. So.
Okay, so first point I'm going to deal with here is I think this is the point in the video where it becomes clear that Bastiat might be more realistically defined as a classical liberal than a neoliberal, because his example of a good immigration policy is not a neoliberal one. He uses a classical liberal era, which is a distinct difference, is a distinct period than neoliberalism. I'm gonna let Sinan deal with that stuff in the comments. It's distracting me. So yeah, it's a classical. The miracle of Chile. If you've read up on the effect that if you read up on the effect that the neoliberal imposition had on the Chilean population, you can see what you're saying is just empirically untrue. A growth in GDP does not translate to better conditions of people's lives necessarily. It just means an economy grew. An economy growing doesn't necessarily mean people's lives improve. So, yeah, on the immigration point, yeah, classically liberal immigration policy, one where the government would maybe step back and not provide particular exemptions on particular groups, is different from a neoliberal one, which would have a particular ethic imposed on them. And that second point about about a controversial group who has the power to hire and fire, who gets to decide what a controversial, what's considered a terrorist group or a controversial group under capitalism? Because right now, the Met Police defines the industrial workers of the world as a terrorist group, and if employers can just fire you for being part of a union, I don't think that's necessarily a great thing. Yeah, I do like the idea of socialism kills economies by making it all about the government, which can't run business, and all about giving people money for nothing, which creates a bad precedent, makes people lazy, and kills employment figures because now people can stay at home and do nothing, which of course they do. That is so wrong. Even if you're so, I'm going to deal with that comment for a second. If you care about GDP, the places where you've seen biggest GDP growth in the world have been Soviet Russia and China. I don't support those countries, but if your measure for what a good country is or a good economy is through GDP, then you're going to have to accept that your favorite countries have to be the Soviet Union and China.
Need to resort to these things tells you something very significant.
Okay, that's time. Gentlemen, I'm going to move on to the audience Q&A because we have an overwhelming amount of questions from everybody, and some of them are pretty interesting, and I think it'll be fruitful to explore some of these, all right?
Sounds good.
Okay, so we'll start with the first one. With the collapse of finance and the housing market in 2008 from deregulation and other factors, with the failure of the American healthcare system as opposed to others, with the commodification of personal data and the lack of power of your data, how the hell can anyone think neoliberalism is a force for good and not a force for driving inequity? So obviously a bit of a loaded question, but I'll let you answer that one first, Bastiat, with 2 minutes on the clock.
Okay, so it was a healthcare, housing market, and look, I mean, the data itself, for example, was given away in exchange for free services. So, like, to say that this data was just given away for nothing, first of all, is questionable. But second of all, the paralysis of our current government is an example of, again, the failure of American government, not neoliberalism, to address some of these pressing needs. Like, for example, there's certainly a place for consumer regulation and consumer protection. The question is how far you want to go. And so I think that is a debate that must always be had in context. For example, we used to regulate the airlines, not just in the sense of regulating them for health and safety, but regulating their prices. And as a result, we priced airlines out of the reach of most Americans. Now, most Americans, in the wake of airline deregulation, can afford to fly, not just because of a decrease in fares, but because fares have been unbundled. So
I actually by accident stumbled upon this today. Not this debate, but the argument he makes about airlines becoming cheaper after deregulation. Turns out it's not true. What happened after deregulation was prices were already declining, and then after Reagan's deregulation of the airlines, they still declined, but they declined at a lower rate, which indicates that there was another thing driving the decline of airline price other than regulation. What happened in the airlines then was a consolidation of and monopolization of the market into a few big actors, and then massive loss in profit, and a whole load of them went out of business, all while airline prices declined at this lower rate than before. So this point he's making there is empirically false.
And therefore, people can choose the kind of flight experience that they want. So, like this notion that there's no addressing some of these issues. I just don't.
In chat, socialism and liberalism are different ideologies. That's not a disputable point. They are. Liberalism is tied, in its definition, to capitalism. You cannot be a socialist and a liberal. You can be a more socially liberal, or you can be a more conservative liberal, but you can't be a socialist liberal.
I don't agree with that. We can certainly address commodification data through reasonable regulations, and again through without having to do away with the notion of capitalism altogether. As far as the housing market goes, again, that was an example of more government intervention in markets. The American government trying to incentivize the purchase of homes rather than the government stepping away from the marketplace. But as it were, even in the wake of the housing market crisis, living standards in the United States have continued to rise unequally, indeed, and inequality remains an issue. But nevertheless, the living standards of all Americans, or almost all Americans, have continued to rise as a result of free trade, global capitalism, and the kind of market-based systems that we're talking about here. So for me, I think the question is not how do we replace neoliberalism, but rather how do we address these flaws? And I've talked about healthcare as one example of that, where there is indeed a need for some state intervention. But state intervention should only be reserved for those areas in which it is necessary.
In the chat, yeah, are you saying that a member, because a Democrat, someone in the DNC, says you're wrong? So, and then a Wikipedia article, is that is that the evidence that you're providing? You're simply speaking wrong about this. That's a bizarre thing to say, that the DNC says you're wrong. You can't be a liberal and a socialist. They're different ideologies. That's just simply the truth. Now, moving on to what Bastiat was saying. So the idea that deregulation didn't cause the financial crisis is bizarre. That is a mad thing to claim. And there's mountains and mountains of evidence and study after study which shows that the financial crash in 2008 was a direct result of deregulation of the financial sector. And that's not like a socialist point. That's neoliberals have been reformed on this point. It's a Keynesian point. That would be someone who is a liberal could argue that that is the case as well, not just a socialist. So you can't say that the 2008 financial crash wasn't a issue of deregulation. It fundamentally was. It's pretty much the case. So, and if you want to blame government, then the issue that the government had and the incentivization of cheap housing, much of that was because there were powerful interests which had captured the government through the accumulation of capital, which then lobbied to deregulate housing systems and incentivize this housing in the first place. Because neoliberalism, like any system in capitalism, is built on endless and continued growth. It cannot sustain itself if profits decline. And you can actually, there's an interesting study I read a few weeks ago which tracked every financial crisis through the falling rate of profit. And the falling rate of profit predict every single financial crash, which is interesting. Let's talk about living standards and inequality for a second as well. So that this idea that living standards have increased is it tends to be true. Living standards tend to increase over time and with growth because you have like better technologies, you have better access to, especially if you are in a Western state which is exploiting the rest of the world, you have better access to technologies. And like I was saying in the chat, the longest sustained period of economic growth happened during the Soviet Union and in China. Not much to do with neoliberalism. And much of neoliberalism's actual growth is boosted by an overinflated financial sector and exported exploitation through globalization. After the financial crash in the UK, living standards actually fell and have been recovering incredibly slowly. So things that neoliberalism served were inequality, and in the UK's case, falling living standards. And inequality isn't just a small problem that you can brush off, because inequality is poverty. Poverty is a function of inequality. Poverty isn't just the ability to meet certain immediate material needs, but it's the ability to function within society. So, for example, previously food and clothing might have been all that you needed to survive in society, and it's become cheaper, not because of free markets, but because not because free markets make them cheaper by themselves, but because those free markets are used to link places where there's deep exploitation, including massive slave labor industries, which is used to grow food and make clothes and technology, and then they use the free market to take the stuff from there and give it to you. So it's hardly like a unidimensional growth for everyone. It's a system built on innate exploitation. But to exist in society today, in the US, you need more than just food and clothes. You need a car, internet, mobile phone, and to be part of culture. And to maintain that level of consumption with low real wage growth like there is in the US, you have to often go into massive debt. And if you take consumer debt, which is essential in financialized economies like neoliberal and today, mostly our poverty analysis avoids including debt. But if you include it in poverty analysis, you can see that the amount of people in debt poverty has been increasing for years now, and especially since the crash of the market, because people don't have the wage growth to keep up with the living standards. They have to go into debt. And if you overall look at poverty rates in the US, they generally conclude poverty, including food security, has risen over the last 2 decades under neoliberalism, all while inequality has spiked massively. And there's been no real wage growth in the US, which later Bastiat will blame on the businesses provided healthcare system absorbing economic growth. But this doesn't account for the fact that in the other most developed neoliberal state, the UK, real wages and living standards have had an unprecedented decline in the post-recession era. So there's some deep empirical points which Bastiat is just wrong about there.
Example, not allowed to unionize. If so, why? And then to Ben, should owners have regulated rights to their property? Example, gold miners have a right to profit, and if so, why? So we'll start with you, Bastiat, 2 minutes.
Okay. Yeah, sure. So I guess the question there chiefly involves unions and democratic workplaces. So one, just to be clear, I have no problem with a voluntarily organized democratic workplace. If you want to have one, I think you should be able to form one. I don't think the state should force existing workplaces to become democratic, quote unquote. So I'm not in favor of that. But I'm also not in favor of many of the laws that the United States has in place, which put the thumb on the scale in favor of employers rather than unions. I think that is another form of state interference that should be rolled back. And a great example of that are the right to work laws that prevail in, I think, about half the states in the country, maybe slightly more than half, which say, in effect, that a company can't, or rather an employee can't be forced to join a union as a condition of taking work, which again interferes in the contractual relationship between a union and a company. It should be between them to resolve whether or not that's a closed shop or an open shop or whatever, but the government shouldn't put its thumb on the scale in that sense. So yeah, and then as far as unionization goes, I think there's also a serious question as to whether some public institutions should have unions at all. Now, this is a very difficult question. It's not a one-size-fits-all thing, but for example, the police, really shouldn't have any kind of union whatsoever. They have full state power and the backing of friendly legislatures. So to say that they should have a union on top of that, which encourages the worst things, the worst of policing, I don't think that should be the case. But there are different cases in other institutions. So not anti-union, but anti-compelled union and compulsion to anti-compelled union and anti-measures that again where the government seeks to keep people out of unions. So.
Okay, Ben, the question.
Okay, so dealing with what Bastiat just said there, and this is him leaning really, really heavily towards a conception of classical liberalism rather than neoliberalism. And if we return to my definition, we can see how the neoliberal state very, 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 very much wants to destroy unions. Classical liberalism being that sort of laissez-faire, we just let people be. Under that conception, I can see how you as a liberal could come to the point of saying, I believe that you should be allowed to have unions if you want, and the state shouldn't stop that. But if you are a neoliberal, then the state is there to destroy elements of collectivization and that's why when Thatcher first came to power, one of the first things she did was wage war on the unions, because it was in their interest, in their ideological goal, to destroy collectivized labour. You can't have neoliberalism without a galvanized need to go after collectivized labour. It just doesn't happen. It's not a neoliberal view. It just wouldn't be. Okay, I think this is another 5 minutes. So it's another 5 minutes of Bastiat talking, and then we'll go over why it's wrong.
Okay, just pull up my notes here. So, we talked a lot about all kinds of different issues today, but I think for me, the proof is fundamentally in the pudding. What is the world that we've created since the 1980s, the neoliberal heyday, this neoliberal hegemony like? And frankly, I know there's a lot of debate about some of the other elements of life in the world today, but I think as far as poverty reduction goes, it's pretty clear. Any way you slice it, poverty is on the decline in the world today, and not just in say the Scandinavian countries, which I guess are again the gold standard of human flourishing, but in countries all around the world that have engaged in economic reform. And to the extent that countries have not, they have not seen those kinds of benefits. A great example of this in practice is the difference between how different countries in Eastern Europe performed after the end of socialism in the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc. When countries in the Eastern Bloc reformed, they thrived. Estonia, the Baltic states, Poland, the Czech Republic, other states in Eastern Europe that engaged in comprehensive reforms, they saw comprehensive benefits. Countries, on the other hand, like Russia, Belarus, and the Ukraine, until very recently, who have not made much in the way of economic reforms, or still very closed societies, have not seen those kinds of benefits. Especially Russia, seems to be saved by its oil prices.
Yeah, it has been quite a good chat. Aside from I don't like when people are insulting each other. I don't want my chat to be nasty place. I like popping off debate, but I don't like nasty debate. So, yeah, I don't like people calling each other, libtards and that. That's just stupid. But I like people saying nonsense about the DNC being socialist. That's fun.
So poverty in the world is on the decline. It's within visible reach, perhaps, of its end sometime this century. And I think that the world today has been defined by this neoliberal hegemony that I read so much about, the process of preparing for this debate. I will concede that this is indeed the policy that defines many of the economic relations between human beings today. And yet I think that is a wonderful thing. Not only because it has made goods so much cheaper, and indeed in the United States, when we talk about frozen wages, we should certainly talk about affordable goods as well. The price of all non-durable goods, virtually all non-durable goods, and many durable goods has gone down. In the United States, we've seen an increase in the cost of services like healthcare, which of course we've talked about. But goods, free trade has made them cheap beyond belief.
again, it's not free trade in itself which makes things cheap. It's the production process which has been exported to places where labour is basically slave labour or very low income, and therefore the goods are produced there and then shipped over to the US. So, you know, my stream title says test. Oh no, I thought I changed it. To it should say genocide and neoliberalism. Oh no, I thought I changed that. I typed in the box. Ah well, it's been a good test.
In the United States in many sectors. So we've seen serious improvements in living standards, and not just here, again, in Europe, in the wider world writ large. Some of those countries that have seen those countries that have not seen those benefits have been those that have been closed off to the world, those that have engaged in various discredited economic experiments like Venezuela, which engaged not just in redistributive socialism, but cronyism in its oil industry and ultimately paid the price after the collapse of oil prices. So to say that these other alternative models have failed because of American intervention rather than ultimately failing under their own weight, I think is unreasonable. But I think it's a good thing that neoliberalism remains the dominant economic paradigm in the world today, because though it is not perfect, though we've still got staggering inequality to deal with, though we've got serious poverty in the world, though we've still got to deal with climate change, a liberal, free market, global capitalism moderated by an active state that seeks not just to preserve property and freedom, but to relieve acute misery and distress is the best way to address the problems of mankind and to create the better world that we all aspire to. Indeed, the more peaceful world that we all aspire to, because, of course, to me, my favorite part about neoliberalism is the notion that free trade has brought more peace between more countries in the world today. So I think,
unless you're, I don't know, Iraq.
It's key to a more prosperous and peaceful world, and in that sense, I think it is definitely a force for good.
Okay, so this, my frame rate is bad. I think it's just a function that my internet is really shit. It would have been good to have, a Labour government that would provide good, fast broadband to everywhere in the country, because out here in the Scottish countryside, it's not great. The internet is bad. There's not much I can do to fix it. I've tried, I've tried various things, but it's the best I can do. So global poverty. The claim that Bastiat makes here about global poverty being reduced, this is his biggest empirical fuck up, because it's just not true. It's simply false. The claim is one that's given by Bill Gates and Stephen. Yeah, my internet is bad. My internet's just really bad. This claim about global poverty being reduced is one that's given by Bill Gates and everyone's favorite professor and member of Epstein's book, Steven Pinker. And it's essentially false. It's based on a poverty line being about $1.90 a day, which is basically roundly agreed as a way to keep the figure low, and it's way too low to be anything meaningful. Yeah, it's a shame we don't have more free market for this internet. It's weird how it happened. Is there a word for it? Natural monopolies, maybe. Yeah. Anyway, by the figure of one people living on $1.90 a day means that only 700 million people live in poverty. But according to the UN's measure, 815 million don't have enough enough calories to eat in a day to sustain minimal human activity. 1.5 billion are food insecure and don't have enough calories to sustain normal human activity, and 2.1 billion suffer from malnutrition. So clearly that figure of $1.90 a day is not very accurate. To update the poverty line to $7.40, which is what Jason Hickel and Peter Edwards, who are world experts on this, argue would be a sort of reasonable lower level, would mean that there's been a light decline in the proportion of the world's population living in poverty since the beginning of neoliberalism, but the actual number of people in poverty has increased from 3.2 billion in 1981 to 4.2 billion today. Hey, nice, thanks for that new follower. Didn't see who it was. I just heard the wee hingy. So then so poverty has increased. The number of people in poverty has increased over the period of neoliberalism. But if you look at where the vast majority of poverty reduction has taken place over the period of neoliberalization, it's been in places like China, under state-led industrialization, protectionism, and regulations, in places where neoliberalism was imposed through IMF and World Bank structural adjustments programs, poverty increased by 1.3 billion and by a rate of 62% to 68% since 1981. And to address that point about failed economic models, it's worth pointing out that outside of China, most of the largest movement against poverty has been in leftist and social democratic states in Latin America. So, if for Bastiat the proof is in the pudding about neoliberalism's effect on the world, it looks like it's been a pretty shitty pudding. More people are in poverty now than during before neoliberalism. So this is like the last clip that I wanted to play of Bastiat, and I've timed that not bad. I was looking for 2 hours. It's about an hour and a half, with some fun all round from the chat. People talking absolute nonsense. My favourite thing in the chat was providing a Wikipedia article as evidence of your claim, and then going to, well, the DNC, you should believe the DNC. Why would anyone want to listen to the DNC about anything? Yeah, overall, the way Bastiat presents his arguments, I think, makes him look closer to a classical liberal than a neoliberal, because he just points to laissez-faire and free markets and arguing that government should stay. Hey, thanks, anxious comrade, for following. Yeah, he thinks that the state should just simply step back and not bother stopping people from unionizations or stopping cooperatives from farming, and those things are deeply anti-neoliberal. Neoliberalism needs to attack collectivization. It's at the core of its theory. A true neoliberal should never think it's okay to form unions. They should always be finding new ways to prevent them from forming, or to break them up in the first place, like Thatcher and Blair did, and then the Lib Dems and the Tories did, and under austerity. Those things are neoliberalism. And at its core, it's an ideology of how the individual should be. And if you don't do things to make that individual be the way that they want, then you're not being a neoliberal. As regarding whether it's a force, whether, like, the argument being presented, neoliberalism is a force for good in the world, I don't think that you can really see that argument through to be logically consistently. We know that the financial crisis was caused by deregulation. The poverty figures that I cited are the true poverty figures. The way that neoliberalism has been moved into welfare programs and brutal workforce welfare programs that seek to increase personal responsibility, the destruction of unionized labour, to reject collectivization, immigration tied to how well an individual becomes an effective capitalist labourer in the economy, the extension of unregulated markets to increase competitiveness, even in universalist systems like healthcare, and this need to impose the moralistic, political and economic neoliberal vision drives actors to expand the dogma internationally through war and coups. With the neoliberal order descending into an increasingly authoritarian and sort of fascistic right wing across the globe, I think it's a mad argument to say that neoliberalism has been in any way a force for good in the world, which is the last thing I would have to say about this Bastiat thing. So yeah, I hope we all enjoyed ourselves. with our mad chat popping off and talking about straw men and weird shit. The Larry Summers paper explains how overaccumulation and inequality has expanded due to the crushing of organised workers. Yeah, there's quite a lot done on that. It's obvious that you can see the declining share of profit going to workers throughout the neoliberal era, and like you can see how inequality has skyrocketed. And of course, it's because workers don't have the ability to bargain for their conditions anymore. It's an obvious result of like how theory works. It's a bizarre logical leap for neoliberals to say, oh, you no longer have unions, so therefore you're more free. It's a bizarre thing to claim.